stood in a garden at sunset and told the woman he loved the truest, saddest thing he knew. One day you'll forget me. And that's how it should be. She looked at him with eyes that never lied and said 6 words back. That's the one thing I can't do. Then he rode away for 25 months into the worst winter Montana had ever recorded. Into 30 hours on horseback in 40 below,
I said my
cold
piece, Clara.
chasing cattle
I'm
into
heading
a
out come
canyon
morning.
that killed everything.
You can't
that
just
went
ride
into
away
it.
from this. We
Into
have
a
too much
dying old
history here.
man's last gift and a debt neither of them could have predicted. Montana, 1885. He left because staying was a mistake he had no right to make. What he didn't know is that the woman standing behind him at that fence line was about to survive her own kind of blizzard, and that a man in a dark suit with more land than God was going to find out exactly how little that mattered to her. Stay to the end, he rides back for her, and what he's carrying in his coat pocket is going to answer a question 25 months in the making. There are moments that divide a life into before and after, not the dramatic ones, not the storms or the fires or the things that arrive with noise and announcement, the quiet ones. The ones that happen in the last light of a summer evening in a ranch yard, with the mountains going gold behind them and the whole world watching. And neither person able to say the thing that needs saying. Wade Coulter had worked the Carver Ranch 18 months. He'd come in the spring of 1884 with a good recommendation and the straightforward intention of doing honest work and saving his wages. He knew every fence line, every pasture rotation, every horse by name. He gave the ranch everything a good hand gives, completely, without complaint, without asking for anything beyond fair wages. What he hadn't planned to give it was his heart. That happened on a Tuesday morning in April of 1884, when Walter Carver brought his daughter out to the stable to check on a mare off her feed. Wade looked up from the stall he was cleaning, and Rosalind Carver looked at him with gray eyes that saw things clearly and said, "Good morning," in the voice of someone who meant it. "Good morning back," he said. He thought about it the rest of the day. For 18 months he thought about it. Now it was September of 1885. The summer was ending, the mountains going gold in the evening light, and Wade Coulter was standing in the ranch yard with his hat in his hands. Rosalind Carver stood 30 feet away in a cream-lace dress. Behind her, at a distance that was not distant enough, stood her parents and the man they had chosen, Edmund Vance. 28 years old, dark suit, a family with more land than God and more influence than the county sheriff. The man Rosalind Carver was going to marry. Wade looked at her, she looked at him. Neither said what needed saying because neither had the right to say it. The evening held them in the particular cruelty of a moment ending before it ever properly began. He hadn't intended to fall in love with his employer's daughter. It wasn't something Wade Coulter had planned or wanted. He'd come to the Carver Ranch in spring of 1884 at 23, with a recommendation and the entirely practical intention of working hard and saving money. It was a good ranch, well managed. Walter Carver had tended it 30 years and understood exactly what he had. Rosalind had been away at her aunt's in Helena when Wade arrived. She came home in April. He was in the stable when her voice carried in from the yard and kept working. Then Walter brought her to check the mare, and Wade looked up and Rosalind looked at him, and her father said, "Wade Coulter, my daughter Rosalind." And Rosalind said, "Good morning, Mr. Coulter," and Wade said, "Good morning, Miss Carver." In terms of words, that was all of it. In terms of everything else, it was considerably more. In the weeks that followed, Wade watched her the way a man watches a rope unraveling in his hands, knowing the size of the mistake and not being able to let go. She rode every morning, not the decorative riding of a woman performing an activity, but the real riding of someone who'd grown up on a Montana ranch and knew horses the way he knew fence lines. She was direct and competent, laughed at things that were actually funny, and never pretended not to know things she knew. He was 23, she was 20, she was his employer's daughter. He understood with the clarity of a man running out of good options that he was in trouble. He told himself the sensible things clearly and repeatedly. Then Rosalind brought him a book in July, simply appeared at the bunkhouse door one evening and held it out and said, "I thought you might like this." He read it in 4 days. Returned it with a note tucked inside about the ending. She found him the next morning and they talked about the book an hour in the shadow of the barn. He understood the sensible things had stopped working. It happened slowly and then all at once. In May, she started bringing water to the hands in the afternoon, all of them. A natural thing, but stayed longest where Wade was working, and the water became conversation. And the conversation became the part of the afternoon he looked forward to before noon even arrived. In June, he fixed the fence on the east side of her mother's garden without being asked. It had been leaning a month, nobody had gotten to it. She found him doing it, watched a while, then picked up the other end of the wire without asking permission and helped him string it. They worked in the comfortable silence of two people who discovered they didn't need to fill the space between them. In August, he realized the feeling wasn't unreturned. He realized it on a Tuesday, when she was coming back from her morning ride and pulled up near the fence where he was working and looked at him with the gray eyes that saw things clearly. And didn't look away. "Miss Carver," he said. She looked at him. "I'm aware of the situation," he said, "what it is and what it isn't. And I'm not going to do anything that puts you in a difficult position with your family." She was quiet a moment. "I know," she said. "I know you won't." She looked at the mountains. "That's one of the reasons," she wrote on before he could answer. Wade stood at the fence a long time, thinking about loving someone in a situation with no good outcome. The book, the hour in the barn's shadow, the east fence of her mother's garden. He thought about a man who does the right thing because it's right, not because it's easy. Then he went back to work. The fence needed finishing. Edmund Vance came to supper in September. Wade had known about him all summer, the whole ranch had. The Vance family owned the largest spread in 2 counties. Edmund was educated, 28, and the match had been understood between the two families since Rosalind was a child, not formally arranged, simply assumed. The way certain things in certain circles are assumed. Knowing about Edmund Vance and watching him step down from a carriage in a dark suit with his family's easy confidence were different things. Wade watched from the fence line, watched Walter Carver come out with the warmth he reserved for people who mattered in the way of his world. Watched Rosalind come out in a dress Wade hadn't seen before and stand beside her parents. She didn't look toward the fence line. He was glad she didn't. He went back to work. That evening at supper, an older hand said, "Vance is here about the Carver girl." "Wedding by spring," people are saying, with the neutral tone of someone reporting weather. Wade ate his supper, said nothing. Lay awake that night thinking about what a man of character does when the situation has no good outcome. He thought about it 2 days. He could stay, keep working, keep his distance, be there when it happened. But being present was a complication in a life that was going to be what it was going to be, and complicating it served nothing except his own unwillingness to go. He could not stay, not for his sake, for hers. He went to find her on a Thursday evening. She was in the garden, the one whose fence he'd fixed in June, cutting the last roses of the season slowly, with the focused attention of someone doing a thing they know is the last time. She looked up when she heard him. She'd known he was coming. He could see it in her face. "You've heard," she said. "Yes." He stood at the garden gate, hat in hands. The Montana evening went gold around them. "I'm going to leave. It's the right thing." She looked at the roses. "I know. I want the best for you," he said, "whatever that looks like." "I meant that." He looked at her directly. "One day you'll forget me, and that's all right." "That's how it should be." She looked up at him, at the worn clothes, the honest face. The man who'd fixed her mother's garden fence without being asked and returned a book with a note tucked inside, and stood at a fence line all summer being exactly who he was and nothing else. She smiled, not sadly, the real smile, the one that meant something. "That," she said quietly, "is the one thing I can't do. Goodbye, Wade." He looked at her. She looked at him. The garden held them in the last light. Neither moved toward the other. Neither had the right to. He put his hat back on. "Goodbye, Miss Carver." "Goodbye, Wade," she said. He walked back through the gate. She stood in the garden until the light was gone, holding the last roses of the season, and didn't go inside until she was certain her face wouldn't tell her mother everything. He left on a Friday morning before the ranch was awake, having given Walter Carver his notice the previous evening, professional, no explanation beyond needing to move on. Carver shook his hand, said he was sorry to lose him. Wade thanked him and went a pack, 1 bedroll, 2 changes of clothes, his tools, his horse, $42. He rode south. Found work 3 days later at a spread owned by an old man named Elias Bramwell, 70 years old, no family. 400 acres in the Southern Valley. He'd been working alone since his last hand quit that summer. Bramwell was direct, paid fairly, and expected the same work Wade had always given. Wade gave it. What Wade didn't know when he arrived was that Elias Bramwell was dying, consumption. The old man told him in November at the kitchen table with the matter-of-fact accuracy of someone who'd had time to process it. 6 months, the doctor says, maybe less. He looked at Wade. I've been watching you work since you got here. You work this land like a man who intends to keep it. He paused. I have no children, no family that merits the word. I'd like to know this land goes to someone who'll work it right. Wade looked at the old man, then at the document on the table. He was 24 years old with $42 and a horse. He thought about it all night. The answer hadn't changed by morning. I'll earn it, he said, or I won't take it. You have 6 months, I have 2 hands. Show me what this land needs and let me show you what I am. Bramwell looked at him a long time. All right, he said. We'll see what you're made of. What came next was the hardest 6 months of Wade Coulter's life. The winter of 1886 arrived in Montana like a judgment. People who lived through it called it the big die-up afterward, with the specific understatement of those who'd survived something that killed everything around them. The temperature dropped to 40 below and stayed there. The snow came horizontally and didn't stop. Cattle froze standing where they stood on ranches across the territory. Men who'd built empires over 30 years watched them die in 3 weeks. Wade saw it coming. He'd ridden enough Montana winters to read November's sky, and what that sky said in November of 1886 wasn't good. He spent 2 weeks before the worst of it preparing, moving cattle to the sheltered draw at the south end of the property, building windbreaks from lumber found in the barn, cutting and stacking feed until his hands bled. When the blizzard hit in late November, the Bramwell herd had 80 head in the most protected position on the property. It wasn't enough. On the storm's 3rd night, the cattle broke from the draw, panicked by wind and cold and the specific terror of animals that understand they're dying, and went north toward the canyon, which was death. The canyon floor flooded every spring and froze every winter, and cattle that went in during a blizzard didn't come out. Wade saddled his horse in the dark in the 40 below cold and rode after them. What followed was 30 hours he never fully described to anyone. He remembered the cold as a physical presence, not weather but something alive, pressing against every part of him, looking for the places he wasn't covered. He remembered losing feeling in 3 fingers on his right hand somewhere around hour 12, and continuing anyway. Because the cattle were still moving and stopping wasn't something he was willing to do. He remembered the horse going down once on the ice and both of them getting up, which wasn't guaranteed. He came back to the ranch house in the gray light of the second morning, leading the last of the strays, 3 fingers black with frostbite, the horse staggering. 78 of the 80 head accounted for. Elias Bramwell was on the porch. He'd been there since dawn, watching for Wade to come back or not. He didn't say thank you. He went inside. Came back out with the deed to the land, his own name crossed out, Wade Coulter written above it in careful old handwriting. You earned it, he said, and held it out. Wade took it with the hand that still worked. Neither of them said anything else. The Montana winter was still happening around them. There was still work to do. The months after Wade left were not what Rosalind had expected. She'd expected to feel the loss sharply, then less sharply, then move forward into the arranged life ahead of her. She'd expected the wedding preparations, spring arriving in order. The preparations began in October: dress fittings, church arrangements, guest lists, the machinery of a wedding between 2 prominent families anticipated for years. Rosalind participated with the composed efficiency of someone doing what's required. Edmund was not unkind, which was the hardest part because unkindness would have been simpler. He was pleasant, educated, genuinely interested in her the way of a man who's been told his whole life he's getting exactly what he deserves. he wasn't wrong enough to make the wrongness undeniable. Then the big die-up arrived. The Carver Ranch wasn't the Vance operation. Walter Carver was careful, his cattle positioned better than most, but the winter still took 30 head the first week. And the hands were stretched thin. In January, Walter rode out to check the north fence in the blizzard, and his horse lost its footing on the ice and threw him. Broken arm, head injury. The doctor stayed 2 days. Rosalind took over not because anyone asked, because it needed doing, and she was her father's daughter, which meant she didn't wait to be asked when something needed doing. She managed the remaining cattle through the worst winter in Montana's recorded history. Managed the accounts, the hands, her mother's fear, and the correspondence with the Vance family, informing them the wedding would need to be postponed. Edmund replied graciously. Summer *, he suggested. She looked at his letter a long time, put it in the drawer, went back to the cattle. In the months that followed the managing, the nursing, her father's slow return of strength, she understood something she'd been avoiding. She'd been going to marry Edmund Vance because she hadn't believed she had a choice. The big die-up had clarified a great many things, that was one of them. What the winter clarified didn't resolve itself all at once, and it didn't resolve itself quietly. In August, once Walter Carver was well enough to sit up through a full supper again, Edmund Vance came back to Clearwater to settle, in his own careful way. When exactly the postponed wedding would finally happen. He arrived with the same easy confidence Wade remembered from that September carriage 2 years before, a man who had never once in his life needed to wonder whether he'd get what he wanted. He stayed at the Carver house 2 nights, and by the second evening, everyone at that supper table understood the visit for what it actually was, not a courtesy call, but a deadline being politely delivered. "I've been more than patient, Rosalind," Edmund said, once her mother had excused herself and Walter, still favoring his healing arm, had followed. "A year of postponements is a long engagement for 2 families who have been expecting this since before either of us could vote. I nearly lost my father this winter," Rosalind said. "I ran this ranch alone for 4 months. I know, everyone knows." "It speaks well of you," he said it the way a man compliments a horse's bloodline, genuine and entirely beside the point he was making. "But the ranch survived, your father's recovering." At some point, Rosalind, the postponement stops being about circumstances and starts being about something else. "I'd like to know which one this is." She was quiet a moment, turning her water glass slowly on the table. "I don't know that I can give you an answer tonight. That," Edmund said not unkindly, "is itself an answer. I think we both know it is." He left the following morning, before breakfast, with the same unhurried composure he'd arrived with, no argument, no scene. Nothing a servant or a hand could later repeat as gossip. He simply thanked Margaret Carver for her hospitality, shook Walter's good hand, and rode out. He did not ask to see Rosalind before he left. She watched from an upstairs window as his carriage went down the lane, and understood, without anyone having to explain it to her, that whatever had been assumed between their 2 families since she was a child had just quietly, permanently ended, not because either of them had made a scene of ending it, but because 2 days of plain conversation had finally said what a year of postponements had only implied. She did not write to him again, he did not write to her. Neither of them ever spoke of it publicly, and the town, in the specific way small towns manage these things, understood the engagement was over roughly a month before anyone said so directly, and simply stopped asking about a spring wedding that both families had quietly stopped planning. Rosalind told her mother only that Edmund understood her feelings had changed. Her mother, who had watched her daughter run a ranch through the worst winter in the territory's history without once asking anyone's permission to do so, did not press for more. Elias Bramwell died in April of 1887, quietly in the bed he'd slept in 40 years. Wade was with him at the end. He'd been with him through the winter, managing the land by day and sitting with the old man in the evenings, listening to 40 years of stories about what the valley had taken to build. The will was filed in Billings, 400 acres, 80 head, 78 surviving the big die-up, 2 replacements bought that spring, the equipment, the water rights, everything. All of it to Wade Coulter, Wade stood in the county office looking at the document. 25 years old, 3 fingers on his right hand that would never fully close again, land and cattle and water rights he hadn't had 2 years before. He'd spent a year and a half becoming someone he hadn't been when he rode south from Clearwater County. He worked the land through spring, worked it harder through summer. In autumn, sitting on his own porch, looking at his own land, he thought about a garden in September and a smile and a woman who'd said, "That's the one thing I can't do." He hadn't stopped thinking about it. He wrote a letters not to Rosalind. He had no right to write to Rosalind. He wrote to Ida Voss at the Clearwater General Store, who knew everything about everyone in the county. Ida wrote back in 2 weeks, 4 sentences. He read them 4 times. The 3rd sentence was enough. He saddled his horse. He rode into Clearwater on a Thursday morning in October of 1887. He'd been gone 25 months. The town looked the same. He tied his horse outside the general store and went in. Ida Voss looked up, looked at him a long moment with the expression of a woman who'd been expecting something and hadn't been sure when it would arrive. "Wade Coulter, Mrs. Voss." She looked at what 25 months had done, not to his face exactly, to the way he stood. A man who owns land stands differently than a man who works it for someone else. Ida had been reading People 40 years. The wedding was postponed in January, she said. Walter Carver had an accident. Rosalind managed the ranch through the big die-up. I know. Your letter, what I didn't put in the letter, Ida said, is that the postponement got extended twice and that Edmund Vance came in August and left after 2 days. And that Rosalind hasn't written to him since. Wade looked at the counter. And Rosalind? Ida looked at him with the specific expression of a woman deciding how much to share. Rosalind Carver, she said, managed that ranch through the worst winter in Montana's history alone while her father healed and her mother worried. She is not the same young woman who cut roses in September of 1885. A pause. She rides the east fence line Tuesday and Thursday mornings, has done since spring. Wade looked at Ida. Today is Thursday, she said. He put his hat on. Thank you, Mrs. Voss. Wade, she said as he reached the door. He stopped. Don't say anything complicated, she said. The simple thing will be enough. He nodded. He went to his horse. He rode toward the east fence line. She was there. He saw her from a distance, the gray horse, the familiar way she sat the saddle. She hadn't seen him yet. He pulled his horse to a walk. She saw him at 50 yards. She stopped. He stopped. They looked at each other across the distance of the east fence line of the ranch where the summer of 1884 had happened, and the book with the note tucked inside, and the hour in the barn's shadow. In the last roses of September. He rode forward slowly. When he was close enough to see her face clearly, he stopped. 25 months she was the same and different. The big die-up and her parents' accident and the postponements and Edmund's 2 days in August had done something to her face, not aged it, clarified it. The way difficulty burns away what's decorative and leaves what's real. He was different too. Land ownership showed. The 30 hours on horseback in 40 below showed. 3 fingers on his right hand that held the reins slightly differently than before showed. She could see all of it and read it the way she'd always read things, clearly, without pretense. Neither spoke a long moment, then she said, "You came back." Not a question, not an accusation, the fact of it stated plainly. Yes, he reached into his coat, took out the county deed, Elias Bramwell's signature at the bottom, his own name where it needed to be. He held it out across the fence. She took it, read it. Looked up, 400 acres, and 78 head, 2 fingers shy of a full hand. He held up his right hand briefly, the 3 that didn't close all the way. She looked at his hand, then his face. "Wade," she said, "I don't care about the 400 acres, I know. But I needed you to know they exist because the last time I left, I said I wanted the best for you, and I meant it. And I needed to come back as someone who'd earned his way to this conversation." She held his gaze across the fence rail. "You were worth this conversation before," she said. "You just didn't believe it." He was quiet a moment. "Do you still believe what you said?" In the garden, she looked at him with the gray eyes that had been seeing him clearly since a Tuesday morning in April of 1884. She didn't smile this time. She just looked at him steadily. That's the one thing I can't do. He got off his horse, came through the fence, stood in front of her. She looked at this man, the honest face, the hand that didn't close all the way, the land he'd earned in a blizzard, the same person he'd always been underneath all of it, and took his hand. Both of them, the one that worked and the one that didn't. He looked at her, holding his damaged hand, and something in him that had been held very tightly 25 months let go. The Montana morning held them both at the east fence line, and the thing that had been impossible was not impossible anymore. Walter Carver received Wade in his study a Friday afternoon, mostly recovered by then, the arm healed, the head injury leaving occasional headaches. Not entirely the man he'd been before January, but close. Wade sat across from him and said what he'd come to say. He didn't perform it, stated the facts. Who he was, where he'd been, what the big die-up had cost him and what it had given him, what Elias Bramwell had left him and why, what he was asking. Plain, looking Walter directly in the eye the way he'd always done everything. Walter listened. When Wade finished, he was quiet a long time. You left my ranch in September of 1885. Yes, sir, no explanation offered. I had reasons I couldn't give you at the time, Wade said. I can give them now if you want them. I think I know what the reasons were. Walter looked at his hands. My daughter ran this ranch 4 months while I couldn't. She managed the hands and the accounts and the cattle through the worst winter this territory has seen. She did it without being asked and without complaint. He looked at the window. She's her own person. I forgot that somewhere. He stood, extended his hand. She's in the garden. Go ask her what she thinks. Wade went to the garden, the same garden, the east fence still standing correctly from June of 1884. Rosalind was there with her mother, who'd known something was happening since Thursday morning. When Wade came through the gate, Helen Carver said, I'll go check on your father, and went inside with the transparent discretion of a woman who considers herself subtle. Wade stood in the garden. Rosalind looked at him. My father, she said. Yes. What did he say? He said to ask you what you think. She looked at the gate where her mother had been, then at him. I think, Rosalind said, that I've been thinking the same thing for 25 months. He crossed the garden, stood in front of her. Took her hand carefully, the right one that didn't close all the way, her hand over his. She felt the difference in the fingers. She didn't let go. I'm not the same man who left, he said. No, she said, but you're the same person. He looked at her. Yes. That's exactly right. They married at the Clearwater Church in December of 1887. Not elaborate. Neither of them wanted elaborate. The church in winter, the town present, the mountains through the windows going white with the season's first real snow. Rosalind wore cream, not the dress that had once been fitted for a different wedding, something simpler, which was what the occasion was. Walter Carver walked his daughter to the altar. Helen Carver sat in the front row with the expression of a woman who'd revised a position and found the revision correct. Wade stood at the altar in the best clothes he owned, better than what he'd owned 25 months before, because a man with 400 acres could afford better clothes. But not so different. He was unrecognizable as the man who'd fixed a garden fence in June of 1884 and returned a book with a note tucked inside. Rosalind came down the aisle looking at him the way she'd been looking at him since a Tuesday morning in April of 1884. He looked back the same way. They settled on the Bramwell land, 400 acres Elias Bramwell had built over a lifetime and left to a young man who'd ridden 30 hours through a blizzard to earn it. Rosalind brought her knowledge of the land, the accounting competence that had kept her parents' ranch running through 4 months of crisis, and the specific capability of a woman who'd spent 23 years being prepared for a life that turned out not to be the one she was preparing for. She was prepared for this one instead. Walter Carver came for Sunday supper starting in January. By spring, he was riding the fence lines with Wade, pointing out things about the Southern Valley terrain Wade hadn't yet learned, and Wade listened the way he'd always listened to useful information. The two men didn't become easy with each other immediately. They became honest first, which was the foundation the rest was built on. By summer, it was solid. On an evening in April, the April that would have been the Vance wedding, had 2 days in August gone differently, Rosalind stood on the porch of her house and looked at the 400 acres in the last light, thinking about a garden in September of 1885, a smile. And the thing she'd said. She'd been right, she still was. She heard Wade's boots on the porch behind her. He came and stood beside her, looking at what they'd built and what they were going to keep building. He put his arm around her, the right arm, the hand that didn't close all the way, resting on her shoulder. She put her hand over his. Neither said anything, neither needed to. That same week, a letter arrived from Ida Voss at the general store, forwarding on a small piece of county gossip she thought Rosalind might want to hear before someone less careful told her first. Edmund Vance had married that spring the daughter of a banking family out of Helena, a sensible match by all accounts. The kind two prominent families arrange when they've stopped waiting for the version of the story that includes real feeling. Rosalind read the letter once, felt nothing sharper than a kind of distant, settled peace, and folded it into the same drawer where she'd once kept his gracious, patient letter suggesting *summer. She did not feel the need to write back to anyone about it. Some doors, once closed honestly, simply stay closed, and there is a particular relief in that which nobody warns you about beforehand. Wade Coulter stood in a garden in September of 1885 and said, "One day you'll forget me." He said it because he was a man who told the truth, and the truth, as he understood it then, was that time and distance do what they do. They diminish things, smooth the edges of what was, make room for what has to be. Rosalind smiled at him and said, "That's the one thing I can't do." She was right. For 25 months, through wedding preparations and the worst winter in Montana's recorded history, through nights managing a ranch while her father healed, through 2 plain days in August that ended a decade of assumption without a single raised voice, through letters she stopped writing to a man who was never the right one, she was right every single day. And Wade, who rode away because it was the right thing and spent 25 months becoming someone he could come back as, not a different person. The same one who'd ridden 30 hours through 40 below cold because 78 cattle needed somebody willing to go after them. Who'd taken a dying old man's land by earning it with frostbitten fingers, who came back to a garden gate as a man who'd proved what he was made of, not to impress anyone, but because that was simply who he was. He came back the same person she could not forget. She had always known that some things cannot be forgotten because they were never meant to be. They are meant to be waited for and earned.